In a valley pressed between the Western Pyrenees and the Bay of Biscay, there is a language that matches nothing else spoken on Earth. There is a blood type that appears here at a rate found almost nowhere else on the planet. There's a surname system, a set of farmhouses, a genetic signature that geneticists have spent over a century trying to explain and repeatedly gotten wrong. And for decades, one theory dominated everything: that the Basque people are living fossils, an unbroken line stretching back to the Ice Age, untouched by everyone who ever crossed their mountains. New genome data says that story is not what happened. What actually happened is stranger, more specific, and it rewrites the timeline by thousands of years. This is not folklore. This is not internet speculation stitched together from 23andMe. Screenshots. The most detailed genetic study of the Basque population ever conducted was published in the journal Current Biology, led by David Comas, a professor of biological anthropology at Pompeu Fabra University, and the Institute of Evolutionary Biology, a joint center of the Spanish National Research Council and UPF in Barcelona. His team analyzed genome-wide data from nearly 2,000 modern and ancient individuals, scanning over 600,000 genetic markers per person, sampled across dozens of villages in the Basque country and the surrounding regions of Spain and France. Alongside this, a separate landmark study published in the journal Science, led by geneticist Inigo Olalde, working with the ancient DNA laboratory of David Reich at Harvard Medical School, sequenced the genomes of 271 ancient individuals recovered from across the Iberian Peninsula, spanning roughly 8,000 years. Together, these two research efforts form the most complete genetic picture the Basque people have ever had. And that picture does not match the legend. For most of the 20th century, three competing theories tried to explain the Basque puzzle, and researchers genuinely could not agree on which one was right. The first held that Basques shared common ancestry with populations in the Caucasus, thousands of miles to the east, based on scattered linguistic comparisons that most specialists now consider extremely weak. The second proposed that Basques descended from ancient Iberians, who migrated up from North Africa somewhere between 4,000 and 8,000 years ago, an idea built more on geography than on hard genetic evidence. The third, and by far the most popular in the public imagination, was the Paleolithic remnant theory, the idea that the Basques are the last unmixed descendants of Europe's original Ice Age hunter-gatherers, a population that supposedly missed every major migration that reshaped the rest of the continent. That third theory is the one that made it into documentaries, textbooks, and 100 years of casual conversation about Basque identity. It is also the one that full genome sequencing has now most directly complicated. Here's the concept you need before anything else makes sense. Imagine every population in Europe as a river system. Rivers merge, rivers split, rivers pick up sediment from every tributary they pass. Most European populations today are the downstream result of at least 3 or 4 major rivers merging together over thousands of years: hunter-gatherer ancestry, early farmer ancestry from the Near East, and a massive wave of steppe ancestry that swept in from the Pontic-Caspian grasslands starting around 4,000 years ago. The old myth about the Basques was that their river never merged with anything, that they were a spring flowing straight out of the Paleolithic, untouched for 40,000 years. It is a beautiful image. It is also, according to the genome data, incorrect. What the ancient DNA actually shows is that the Basques did receive all 3 of those ancestral rivers, just like their neighbors. Olalde's team found that by around 4,000 years ago, incoming groups carrying steppe ancestry replaced roughly 40% of Iberia's genetic makeup, and almost 100% of the Y chromosomes present on the peninsula at the time. That is not a subtle shift. That is a near total replacement of the paternal line across an entire landmass. And crucially, the Basque region was not exempt from this. The people who would become the Basques absorbed this steppe ancestry just like everyone else on the peninsula. The idea that they simply sat out the great migrations of prehistoric Europe does not hold up. Something else happened instead, and it happened later than anyone expected. Here's the part that actually explains the mystery. The genetic uniqueness of the Basques is not a story about where their ancestors came from. It is a story about what stopped happening to them and when. According to Comas and his team, the defining event was not the Paleolithic, not the Neolithic farming transition, but the Iron Age, roughly 2,500 years ago. Up until that point, the population that would become the Basques was genetically a fairly typical Iberian population, shaped by the same layered waves of hunter-gatherers, farmers, and steppe migrants as everyone around them. Then, starting in the Iron Age, something shifted. Gene flow into the region slowed dramatically, while the rest of the Iberian Peninsula kept absorbing new populations. Romans marching through, Phoenician and Greek traders settling coastal towns, later waves of migration from North Africa during the medieval period. The Basque country largely did not. Comas put it directly. His team found no meaningful trace of Roman genetic influence in the Basque samples, and none of the North African ancestry that shows up in most other Iberian populations. Everyone else's river kept merging. Theirs quietly stopped. Now stack that number next to something you can actually picture. 2,500 years of relative isolation is roughly the same span of time separating you from the founding of the Roman Republic. It's also close to 100 human generations living in the same set of valleys, largely marrying within the same regional network. Generation after generation, while a slow trickle of surrounding populations kept getting genetically overwritten by newcomers around them. 100 generations. That is not a remote ancestral memory. That is a population that has been quietly, consistently isolated since before written Basque history even began. The genome-wide data adds a further layer of resolution here. Through admixture analysis, Comus's team identified 2 distinct ancestry components running through the modern Basque population. The larger component is shared broadly with other European populations, and it even carries faint traces detectable at low levels in samples from the Middle East, and the Caucasus and North Africa, a distant echo of the same deep migrations that shaped the entire continent, not evidence of a separate origin, but proof that Basques were never actually cut off from that shared human story to begin with. The smaller secondary component is one found at higher frequency, specifically among populations from Central and Eastern Europe, consistent with the arrival of steppe-related ancestry during the Bronze Age. When the researchers folded ancient DNA into this same analysis, the picture sharpened further. Present-day Basques trace most closely back to a combination of pre-Neolithic hunter-gatherers and the early Neolithic farmers who followed them, with the added related layer sitting on top, exactly the same 3-part inheritance found across most of Western Europe. There is no fourth mysterious ingredient. There is no missing Caucasus component, no distinct North African founding population. The recipe is the same recipe as everyone else's. What changed is that after the Iron Age, no one added anything new to the pot. Recapping where we are so far, the Basques are not an unbroken Ice Age relic, and they did receive the same major ancestral inputs as the rest of Iberia. What made them different was a dramatic slowdown in mixing with outside populations, beginning specifically in the Iron Age. Now, here's where it gets more interesting, because researchers wanted to know why the isolation happened at all. What actually kept the gene flow from creeping back in over 2,500 years, the way it did almost everywhere else in Europe? The leading explanation on the table right now is the language itself. Euskara, the Basque language, is what linguists call an isolate. It is not related to any other living language on Earth, not distantly, not through any known family tree. Every other language spoken in Western Europe today, from Spanish to French to English to Irish, descends from Indo-European roots that trace back to those same steppe migrations. Euskara does not. It appears to predate the arrival of Indo-European speech in the region entirely, a linguistic island surrounded on every side by languages that share none of its structure or vocabulary. Comus's research team proposes that this language barrier may have functioned as a genuine biological boundary. In a region where nearly everyone around you speaks a completely unrelated language, day-to-day intermarriage with outsiders naturally becomes rarer. Fewer travelers settle permanently. Fewer daughters and sons marry across the linguistic line. Over enough centuries, a cultural boundary can leave a measurable genetic signature. It is not a wall built out of stone. It is a wall built out of grammar, and it appears to have worked almost as effectively. There's also a question worth sitting with here because the study did not stop at explaining why Basques differ from their neighbors. It also found that Basques differ meaningfully from each other. Comus's team discovered clear internal genetic structure within the Basque country itself, communities in geographically closer valleys, and towns turned out to be more genetically similar to one another than to Basque communities on the opposite side of the region. In a population already defined by isolation from the outside world, there was a second, smaller layer of isolation happening internally, shaped by the region's famously rugged terrain. Steep valleys and mountains passes that made travel difficult for centuries did not just shape culture and dialect, they left a fingerprint inside the genome itself. Now let's get into the Y chromosome, because this is where the story gets its most striking single data point. Among Basque men, one paternal lineage dominates at a frequency rarely matched anywhere else in Europe. Haplogroup R1b, and specifically a branch within it called R1b DF27. R1b itself is common across Western Europe generally, a legacy of that steppe migration wave from thousands of years ago. But the concentration of the DF27 subbranch, specifically within Basque populations, is unusually high, high enough that population geneticists use it as one of the clearest genetic fingerprints separating Basque men from their immediate Iberian and French neighbors. In the language of population genetics, This is exactly what you would expect from a population that received the same ancestral paternal lineage as everyone else during the Bronze Age, and then simply stopped mixing with outsiders long enough for one specific branch of that lineage to become dominant through generations of relative isolation. It's a genetic echo of the same isolation story, just written on a different chromosome. Then there's the detail that even people with no interest in genetics have heard about: Rh-negative blood. The Basque country has one of the highest recorded frequencies of negative blood type anywhere on the planet, a trait that shows up far less frequently in almost every other population researchers have measured, including the immediate neighbors just across the linguistic border. For decades, this fact got recruited into the same old myth, proof, people assumed, of some ancient, separate, almost otherworldly origin. The more grounded explanation, consistent with everything the genome data shows, is much simpler. Isolated populations tend to see certain traits, especially recessive ones, rise in frequency over time simply because the gene pool is smaller and more self-contained. It's the same genetic mechanism you see in other long isolated human populations worldwide. Nothing about it requires an exotic origin story. It requires exactly the kind of multi-thousand-year regional isolation the DNA has already confirmed through completely separate lines of ASO. There's one more genetic thread worth pulling on before moving to how all of this fits together, and it comes from the maternal side of the family tree. Mitochondrial DNA, passed down only from mother to child, tells a slightly different story than the Y chromosome does. Basque mitochondrial lineages are, for the most part, common European lineages also found widely across the rest of the continent, which on its own would seem to undercut the idea of deep separateness even further. But researchers have also documented traces of certain older mitochondrial variants persisting at slightly elevated frequency in the region, compared to immediate neighbors, hints of maternal lineages that stretch further back than the Iron Age boundary that reshaped everything else. To be clear, this is not proof of an unbroken Paleolithic maternal line either. It is a much smaller, subtler signal than the dramatic paternal story written in R1b DF27, but it is a reminder that the full picture has texture. The father's side story and the mother's side story do not move in perfect lockstep, and that kind of asymmetry is itself a normal feature of how isolated populations accumulate their genetic identity over centuries of regional marriage patterns. It's worth pausing on how these different threads triangulate, because that is what makes this more than just one lab's opinion. Combs's genome-wide study, working primarily with modern samples layered against ancient DNA, independently arrives at the Iron Age isolation timeline. Olalde and the Reich Labs team, working almost entirely from directly sequenced ancient skeletal remains across the broader Iberian Peninsula, independently arrives at the same conclusion from the opposite direction, describing present-day Basques as best explained not as an ancient, untouched relic population, but as essentially a typical Iron Age Iberian population that simply never underwent the later waves of admixture that reshaped everyone around them. Two separate research teams, two different methodologies, one modern genome-focused and one ancient DNA-focused, converging on the same historical turning point. That is what a real scientific consensus looks like being built. In real time, not a single headline, but independent lines of evidence lining up. Now here's the part that connects everything back to identity. If the Basques were never a Paleolithic time capsule, does that make their story less remarkable? If anything, it's the opposite. A population that received the same complex layering of hunter-gatherer, farmer, and steppe ancestry as the rest of the continent, and then held a linguistic and genetic boundary firm for 2,500 years, while nearly every population around them was repeatedly reshaped by Romans, by North African migrations, by later medieval movements. That is not a passive relic sitting still while history happened elsewhere. That is an active, continuous act of cultural and biological persistence, generation after generation, without needing myth to make it impressive. Before going further, it's important to be honest about where the certainty in this story actually ends, because that matters as much as where it begins. What these studies establish is population-level history, broad statistical patterns built from hundreds of ancient and modern genomes analyzed together. They are not, and cannot be, proof about any single named individual or any one specific ancestral lineage traced person to person across thousands of years. Nobody is claiming to have sequenced the DNA of a specific named Basque ancestor from the Iron Age and traced an unbroken line to a living person today. That kind of individual-level certainty simply does not exist in ancient DNA research at this scale, and no honest geneticist claims otherwise. There is also real internal debate still unresolved. Researchers agree the isolation intensified sharply after the Iron Age, but exactly how much earlier cultural or genetic distinctiveness may have existed before, that point remains an active area of study. with some uniparental marker research, suggesting hints of pre-Neolithic continuity that full genome-wide studies haven't fully settled either way. And the sample sizes, while the largest ever assembled for this population, still represent a fraction of the full historical Basque-speaking region, meaning finer-grained conclusions about specific valleys or specific centuries carry wider margins of uncertainty than the broad, well-supported headline findings do. To be clear, none of this undermines the core discovery. It just means the picture is a population-scale portrait, not an individual family tree, and treating it as more than that would be its own kind of myth-making, which brings us back to where this started, a language that matches nothing else on Earth. A blood type frequency that stands out on every world map of human genetic diversity. A paternal lineage concentrated more heavily here than almost anywhere else in Europe. For a long time, the explanation offered for all three was the same. They must be ancient, untouched, separate from the rest of us since the Ice Age. The real explanation turns out to be more human than that. The Basques received the same ancestral inheritance as their neighbors, the same hunter-gatherer roots, the same farming migrations, the same steppe herders sweeping across the Bronze Age. Then, starting roughly 2,500 years ago, somewhere in the Iron Age, they simply kept speaking a language nobody else understood, kept marrying within their own valleys, kept the door only barely open while the rest of the continent kept letting new populations in. Isolation, not origin, is the actual signature written across their genome. And in a way, that makes the story more remarkable, not less, because it was never about where they came from. It was about a boundary a small mountain population managed to hold quietly for 100 generations, right up to the present day. So here's the question worth sitting with in the comments. Which detail changed your understanding more? Finding out the Basques absorbed the same steppe ancestry as the rest of Europe? Or finding out that the real turning point was an isolation that began in the Iron Age, not the Ice Age? If this kind of ancient DNA detective work is something you want more of, subscribing keeps these deep dives coming.